The second question, what builds upon it, is what some people believe. It's that somehow the Sabbath is not so important in the New Testament, that it's lost some of its seriousness, that it was to be rigid in the Old Testament, but then it's kind of light and fluffy and not so serious in the New Testament. And they take this because the scribes persecuted Christ over the Sabbath issue. You remember that Jesus healed people on the Sabbath. They chastised him for that. And also there was an occurrence where his disciples had a simple meal while they were traveling. And the scribes and Pharisees were upset about that too. Now, does this mean that the Sabbath somehow is smaller, weaker, less important in the New Testament than the Old Testament? Well, the first thing you got to remember is, did Jesus live in the New Testament or the Old Testament? The answer is Jesus lived in the Old Testament. Jesus was circumcised the 8th day. Jesus observed Passover meals. Jesus was involved in going to synagogue worship, Jewish worship. He lived in the Old Testament, not the New Testament. So what Jesus did was explain the Old Testament law that existed in his day. And he did so by explaining that there are two exceptions. There are two exceptions regarding the Sabbath law. And he didn't just say, well, now there's two exceptions, but back in the older Old Testament, there was no exception. No, he actually used the Old Testament. He talked about David and the showbread. And he said, look what David did. What did he do? He explained the Sabbath day and how it was used in the older Old Testament and how it is still to be viewed and done today. In other words, he wasn't changing the law. He was expounding, teaching what the law always was. That there was room for mercy and compassion in the Old Testament. People miss that. And that's why they get confused and think there's a weaker Sabbath than the New Testament, but there isn't. Now, one thing that points to this is that of all the things the scribes and Pharisees could find guilty about Jesus, these were the only two things. They never charged him with working on the Sabbath day. They never charged him with not going to synagogue on the Sabbath day. Jesus wasn't guilty of any of the other things. He was only guilty of these exceptions, which were not violations of God's law. And so that tells us that Jesus was a strict Sabbatharian, that he observed the Sabbath with all due diligence.